Hello, my name is Jeff Gunzel, and I am a professional counselor and the executive director of the Interdisciplinary Council on Development and Learning. ICDL is an organization that was founded by Dr. Stanley Greenspan, and we're actually celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. We are the official home of DIR and DIRFloortime, and the home of the professional certificate program in DIRFloortime. So I am here today to talk to you about understanding functional emotional development. Going to take a very quick look at this, but I really want to touch upon a few key ideas in regards to promoting functional emotional development. And what I want to start with is, I peeked ahead. What I want to start with is the idea that this developmental window of opportunity can always be opened. We get told that oftentimes that somehow there's this window of opportunity and we have to make sure that we get in it and that we move quickly. And while we absolutely want to get services and supports to every child as early as we can, we also know that the window of opportunity doesn't just close, that we can promote development for any child at any point. And it doesn't even have to be a child. Give me someone that's 5 years old or 50 years old. I can work with them to promote their development, and in a really meaningful way. And one of the keys to that is affect. Affect is what Dr. Greenspan talked about all the time. In all of his presentations, if he asked a question at a conference, 75% of the time he'd be right if you said the word affect, because everything's centered around affect. And our emotional development centers around affect. I find that people struggle with really understanding the full range of what affect is and the full complexity of what affect is. People often think of just the emotions. So I want to start out by looking at affect from what social psychology talks about as these three channels into the psyche or into the mind. They talk about affect, behavior, and cognition. Many programs out there that address mental health and developmental challenges focus on behavior and cognition. And I tend to think that part of the reason that there's so many programs that use those channels is because they're a little easier to see. We can observe behavior. We know if we think about something in a very positive light, it's going to impact how we feel about it. I can increase behavior by giving rewards. I can decrease behavior by giving punishment. We can measure it, we can see it. It's honestly quite simple and straightforward. Affect isn't quite so simple and straightforward. It's a little more complex than that. And it's a little more abstract. But it's a powerful, powerful avenue, powerful pathway when you understand how to use it and what it really is. Affect is the master organizer and integrator for our bodies. It's what brings together our actions, our thoughts, our movements, our behaviors, all integrated by affect. And affect is intertwined with all of that as well. Think about a smell. Let's think about your favorite food. You smell your favorite food. Do you get a happy feeling when you smell your favorite food? Or say you smell rancid food. Do you get a bad feeling? You probably do. Because our feelings are attached to our sensations. What about doing a movement that you like? When you were a little kid, did you like to jump on the trampoline or swing on the swing? Did that make you happy? Now, maybe those movements were overwhelming and maybe it scared you. Maybe it made you sad. Maybe as an adult, sitting and listening to this, you give yourself a good stretch and that feels good. You get an emotional connection to it because affect, that emotional process, is intertwined with our movements, with our behaviors. What about thinking about something that happened to you that was more traumatic or more difficult? Do you get an unsettled feeling, a sad feeling, a scared feeling? Or maybe something that happened to you that was really exciting and good, something wonderful that happened. You probably, if you think about that right now, my guess is if we had a video camera of you thinking about one of your happiest memories, we probably start to see you smile to some extent. Because that affective process, while you're thinking about a memory, affect is intertwined with it. It's all interconnected. Affect is essential for human development. We are born dependent upon relationships. Babies won't survive unless they have a relationship with a caregiver. What brings that connection together? Affect. It's the emotional process. Now, one of the frustrating things, and one of the reasons that I think affect has been less utilized, especially prior to Dr. Greenspan coming on the scene and really bringing an understanding of affect to the world, goes back to the Stoics. In 67 BC, they presented the idea that you are a strong person if you control your emotions. How often do we equate strength to someone that controls their emotions? Or even at times weakness to someone that maybe looks like they don't control their emotions, that are more expressive about their emotions. We have this long history of thinking about emotions as something that should be controlled. And what Dr. Greenspan really presented to us was there's a lot more to emotions than that. That emotions, that affective process, is essential for our development. I was watching a video of Dr. Greenspan from years ago, but I was just watching it recently, and he was talking about how he read an article, I want to say it was in the New York Times, but he read an article about the development of consciousness, and that they were doing research trying to figure out where in the brain consciousness exists, and that basically they weren't having any luck, and they haven't had any luck since then. This has been a debate going on for centuries about what is consciousness, where does it come from? Well, there's a few theories about consciousness out there. Two main theories about consciousness, actually. And one of them talks about what drives the development of our conscious is an intrinsic causal power, that sense of agency, that sense that I can impact my world. What develops that sense of agency? What develops that sense that I can impact my world, that intrinsic motivation? Affect. Affect is what drives that intrinsic motivation. And so I think this all interconnects with what Dr. Greenspan essentially theorized in that video I watched. Now, this wasn't the central part of his work. It was really kind of a side conversation he was having about it in one of his presentations. But that affect is central to the development of consciousness, to the development of who we are and what's important to us, why we're happy about certain things, sad about other things. And it is hard to identify where consciousness is, and researchers haven't identified where in the brain consciousness exists, but it does. And what drives it is affect. It's that emotional experience of the world. It's a connection of those sensations, those thoughts, those feelings, those behaviors, those actions, all integrated and organized by our affective process. So I'm going to talk about how affect drives functional emotional development. But I quickly, for those of you that may not be familiar with floor time, I very quickly want to give a little introduction to it. So DIR, Developmental Individual Differences, Relationship-Based Theoretical Framework or Model, was developed by Dr. Greenspan and is a way of understanding human development. The D, the developmental part, is about understanding the developmental process, in particular the social emotional developmental process. And the I, the individual differences, is all about how each one of us in our own unique way perceive and interact with the world, because we all have our very unique ways. And it can be very subtle. I talked about the smell of food. I may get a really positive feeling from the smell of smoked fish. Someone else might get a very different feeling, almost a disgusting feeling to that same smell. There's subtle differences like that. And then obviously for individuals that have more significant challenges, have developmental challenges, those individual differences can be much more pronounced and much more complicated and make development more difficult, or at times offer real strength to the developmental process. But we give a lot of attention to those individual differences and how we each perceive and interact with the world. And then relationships. Affect is present and communicated and the key ingredient of relationships. Relationships is what fuels development. So that's the theoretical framework. And then we take that theoretical framework and we put it into practice using floor time. Floor time is the key way to fuel that developmental process and put it into practice, figuring out how we focus on the development, understand the individual differences, and use relationships in an interactive process to move forward that developmental process. Now, floor time, just one note about it, the name is a little bit of a misnomer because it's about being on the floor when it comes to young kids, but it's really much more about meeting the individual where they're at. For young kids, it's on the floor. For an adolescent, it may be standing up at a table in a classroom, whatever it is. For an adult, it may be sitting at chairs. But whatever it is, it's about meeting the person where they are at and beginning from their interests, their strengths, and building from there. Two words that Dr. Greenspan used over and over again as he talked about floor time and the process of floor time is that while we're following the child's lead, the two words that he always used was we're expanding and elaborating. So we're beginning where the child's at, we're following the child's lead, and we're expanding and elaborating. So this little talk isn't about how to use floor time. We have all sorts of courses for that. But I want to get into the D, the developmental capacities, and just take a quick look at how important these developmental capacities are for our ability to be successful in the world and to function on a day-to-day basis. So we look at these 6 core developmental capacities, beginning with an ability to be self-regulated and interested in the world, that you're okay in your own skin, you can handle all the lights and the sounds and everything going on, and be interested in the world. This emerges right at birth. Now, one of the things that as floor time has developed over the years, one of the things that we've really kind of shifted in the way we talk about when these developmental capacities happen, is we really talk more about when they emerge, because self-regulation may emerge at birth, and in the first few months of life, a lot of really neat things happen to support that development of the capacity for self-regulation. But I can help a 50-year-old develop that capacity in a deeper way for self-regulation. So we talk about when it emerges, but it doesn't have an end point. You can continue to grow and develop throughout the lifespan, which goes back to what I said at the very beginning about this window of opportunity for development can always be open. So no matter what child you're working with, if you're working with a 2-year-old or you're working with a 20-year-old, you can help promote the developmental process. So we start with this capacity for self-regulation and interest in the world. And if you're able to be reasonably well regulated, you then can engage with others and begin to relate with others. And once you're able to engage and relate, you start to be able to have back and forth interactions. May just be gestural, nonverbal interactions. And for typically developing kids, this is a pre-verbal, this emerges before language emerges. So it's all the nonverbal communications. And then as you continue to get into this back and forth communication, you start to be able to engage in more complex communication and what we call shared social problem solving. Sorting out that I have a different idea than someone else does. That sense of who I am and that it's different than the child starts to understand that they're different than mommy and they have a different perspective than mommy. And then as you develop that capacity for being able to engage in more complex communication, shortly after that, the emergence of the use of symbols and engaging in for little kids in pretend play, and starting with that to engage in an increasingly abstract world and to be able to hold ideas in your mind about things that are going on and have symbols and representations for things. Even representations for emotions, being able to raise emotions to ideas. So emotions are in many ways very abstract. And so all of this helps develop this ability to engage in an abstract world. And when you can start to really hold those ideas in your mind, you can then in the next capacity begin to make interconnections amongst those and be able to think logically and start to reason through things. So these 6 core developmental capacities are essential for life, and we can promote these 6 core developmental capacities at any point for any child. And again, not just any child, anybody, adult as well, older child, adolescent, young adult, whatever it is, we can work on developing these 6 core developmental capacities. So this first capacity of self-regulation and interest in the world. The capacity for self-regulation really begins at birth when the child is in mommy and daddy's arms being rocked back and forth. And it's developed initially really through co-regulation. The caregiver shares their own regulation with the child and helps the child get to that just right zone of regulation, that just right point of arousal, that they're able to be calm and relaxed, but also interested in the world, that balance of calmness, but also interested in the world. That capacity for regulation is developed. It's developed, not necessarily learned. We learn self-control techniques, which is more, I see self-control techniques as a little bit more of a top-down process. Self-regulation is much more of a bottom-up. It's developed initially through co-regulation. And with a lot of our kids, we do things with movement, things that connect in with the brain and the body in a much more developmental bottom-up process. And that capacity for self-regulation really sets us up to then be able to engage with others. This second capacity is really about just being with others. As professionals and parents, we often get focused on doing. What are we going to do, and how are we going to teach, and what skills are going to get learned, and it's doing. This capacity is about being. I get worried, and I'm not alone in this, that in the world that we live with all of the screens and all of the information coming at our kids, and with the screens being kind of this middleman between communication often, I get worried that we're not spending enough time just being. This capacity is developed through just being with others. And it develops that ability or that interest and that want to be engaged with others. You know, a lot of times we have kids who we say they have poor attention. I find a lot of the kids that have poor attention, the root of it is more challenges in this capacity for engagement. Because if you have difficulty in engaging with others, well, you're probably going to be bouncing around from one thing to the next. So this core capacity for engagement then allows us to really get in some back and forth, because if we can stay engaged, we then can get in some back and forth communication. And so at capacity 3, which again, this is for typically developing kids, a pre-verbal capacity. This is a lot about all the gestural communication, all the nonverbal communication. It can include verbal communication, but it's all of that communication and that ability to engage in this back and forth interaction. The purposeful part is much more about the intentionality. What we want to do at this capacity is help children intentionally begin the communication, intentionally engage in the communication, not just respond to us. I hear a lot of parents say, my child won't respond to me. And one of the first things that I try to get parents to think about is, well, maybe our goal isn't so much just to get them to respond to us. Maybe what we need to start thinking about is responding to them in a different way. So if we build off, if they're leading the way and it's their intentionality and we're, as Dr. Greenspan talked about, following the child's lead, what we are doing is we're developing that sense of more intrinsic motivation, because it's coming from them and we're building from there. So that's part of what we want to see here, is that intentional communication. The child's initiating the communication and beginning that interaction, and there we're following their lead. And getting in this back and forth interaction. And it doesn't have to be a complex, it can be simple gestural communication. I love watching music therapists working with kids at this capacity, because you can get in some really neat back and forth just with a drum. And the child can lead and we can follow. So it's about that real basic communication. And then as that is established and you're able to engage in that back and forth interaction, well, then you can add more to it. You can bring language in. You can engage in shared social problem solving, where children start to realize who they are in comparison to mommy or daddy or whoever else it is. And that they have their own sense of self in comparison to, let's say, mommy. And they may have a different idea about getting that cookie. They want the cookie and mommy doesn't think they should have the cookie because it's not healthy. And they can begin to engage in that debate about whether they should have that cookie or not, and engage in that shared social problem solving with their ideas versus their caregiver's ideas. And that there's so much that happens at this capacity, at capacity 4, that ability to engage in continuous back and forth. So one of the things we want to see here is that the child can just really engage in almost unending circles of communication. They can stay with it, that they can engage in this shared social problem solving with mommy's ideas or daddy's ideas or whoever's ideas, and their own Now, this capacity, you think about adults. How many adults do you know who people will say he avoids conflict? That's one of the things I hear a lot is that, well, he avoids conflict. Well, maybe part of the reason some adults avoid conflict, there can be lots of reasons behind it. There can be bad experiences in life and things and reasons why people avoid conflict. But sometimes it can be because this developmental capacity is more limited. So being able to engage in someone else's ideas and integrate them with yours and be able to work through that social problem solving, when it may take 50 exchanges of communication to do it, if you can't stay in that back and forth communication for 50 circles, then you're not going to get to that point of that shared social problem solving. You'll get frustrated, have a little grown-up temper tantrum, and walk out the room. So these are capacities that aren't just little kid capacities. These are grown-up capacities as well. So a lot happens here. This is a big step for especially our kids with developmental challenges such as autism, getting that sense of self, being able to engage in a shared social problem solving. A lot to do here and a really important step in the developmental process. And it's all, again, driven by affect. The more that rich affective connection is with the child and you, the more that you can help promote these capacities. So then once the child's able to engage in this more complex communication, they start to be able to engage in an increasingly abstract world. And what we see, the hallmark of that we see with kids is to be able to use symbols, to be able to engage in pretend play and start to have representations for real things with pretend things. And that ability to create representations of things, to have symbols represent things and engage in pretend play and an increasingly abstract world allows a child to take their internal, again, the word intrinsically motivated. And if it's intrinsically motivated, it's affectively motivated, it's affectively rich. So these emotional ideas come forward. So we develop our ideas about things, and we can develop creative ideas. And these creative ideas help us take what may be a little more abstract and start to create some representations and ideas about it. Emotions are a great example. Emotions are very abstract in nature in many ways. We can see happy with smiles and sad with tears. But when you look at the full emotional range, there's so much complexity to it and abstractness to it. But part of what happens here is we help the child take those more affectively rich ideas and explore them. The child starts to be able to raise emotions to ideas. This ability to raise emotions to ideas is a really important step in so many ways. I'll give you a concrete example with adults. You have some adults that really struggle talking about emotions and others that really enjoy talking about emotions. And you'll hear some adults, I hear this in marital counseling all the time, where you have one spouse that really doesn't like to talk about emotions, and oftentimes we'll talk about how it just doesn't make sense. And what I would offer to you is that for a lot of those individuals, it's because this capacity is more limited. That ability to raise emotions to ideas is a little more limited. And whether it's a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, 25-year-old, whatever it is, we can develop this capacity. That window of opportunity is open to develop this capacity. And then continuing on to capacity 6, if you're able to think more abstractly and have these creative ideas, you then can start to put it together. You can start to make interconnections and build bridges between these ideas. This is where the ability to really start to think logically and reason through things develops. I must tell you, as someone that's run organizations and hired people for different jobs, I'd much rather hire someone that has a deep capacity for thinking and reasoning rather than someone that just has a lot of book knowledge. Because the capacity for thinking and reasoning, to me, is much more important. Information is easy to come by. We can get information, especially in the world that we live now, so easily. But the ability to think through it and sort through it and figure it out, that's all rooted in this capacity of thinking and reasoning. And again, this emerges for typically developing kids, age 3, age 4, somewhere around there. You really start to see this developing. But again, we can develop this throughout the lifespan. And then there's 3 higher developmental capacities. Dr. Greenspan actually outlined 16 developmental capacities. We focus primarily on these first 6, but I'll just quickly mention 7, 8, and 9. 7 is multiple perspectives. You really start to see that everyone has different ideas and how those different ideas and perspectives interact with each other, and how person's idea may interact with someone else's, which could affect a third person and then circle back to that first person, and how all those perspectives interact with each other. Gray area thinking, people that have a deep capacity for gray area thinking really like the nuances of things and the nuances between the black and the white. And then you move into this capacity 9, this internal standard of self. This is really kind of where your values are developed, and the sense of what's important to you and how that compares to other people. So, but again, it's really the first 6 developmental capacities where the action really is. I hope that this makes some sense. This developmental capacity process is so essential for our kids, whether we're working on education, whether we're working on sensory processing, whether we're working on language development, whether we're working on mathematics, whatever it is. These first 6 developmental capacities are essential for all of that to develop well, and affect is our key ingredient. So I just want to touch upon real quickly our professional certificate program. If you're interested in learning more about FloorTime, we have a professional certificate program, which is outlined here, but we actually have a course that's before this chart called our DIR 101 course. It's an introduction to FloorTime and an introduction to DIR, and it's actually for parents and professionals alike. It's a 12-hour course, pretty much a lecture type course where we try to give you the information about what DIR is and what FloorTime is, really to get you started. And then if you're a professional and want to move on to our professional certificate program, we have a series of courses that help you learn FloorTime. They're very small groups, no more than 12 people in each of these courses. And you work together with typically 2 of our experts to figure out how to do this thing called FloorTime. So I invite you to take a look at our website to learn about the training program, and hopefully come to a course. So the window of opportunity in regards to development can always be open. So go open some windows. Go spend some time with your kids and open some windows. Take a look at this emotional developmental process. There's great resources out there besides our courses. Dr. Greenspan has dozens of books, whether you pick up the book Great Kids or Engaging Autism or Building Healthy Minds. Go learn a little bit about this Use your emotional presence, that affect that we all have, and go open some windows. So in closing, I just want to do a final recognition of Dr. Stanley Greenspan, amazing contributor to the world of infant and early childhood mental health, to our understanding of the developmental process, and just an incredible human and caretaker of children and families. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I hope to see you at a course or a conference in the near future. Thank you.